Welcome to Love and Speak the Truth, a podcast with Sister B and friends. Might get messy, sacred to secular. Don't judge. All voices will be heard here. So listen up. We're going to explore the human experience through the lens of wisdom sharing and faith, with a worldview that might shock you, move you, even downright inspire you. I welcome today Dr. Khalilah Gates. I invite you to wake up, because we're going to get a real understanding of wokeness. Just get ready for a most enlightening conversation full of depth, humor, and encouragement. Dr. Gates is a pulmonologist at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She's a lifelong resident of the West Side of Chicago. She's professor and mentor for medical students and is a mom and wife. Secure in her understanding of the complexity of identity, she's the real deal. She is a person who is never afraid to speak her truth. She shares her wisdom of faith, culture, community, and medicine in a profoundly real and honest way. All right. Hey. Dr. Gates, you're on Love and Speak the Truth. It is so good to have you here. I'm happy to have you on the show. I know you're really busy, but you made time and I'm excited. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and thank you for the invitation and looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, me too. So we're going to start off strong. And I'm going to, first of all, ask you, what do you think about this notion of woke? But as you consider that, perhaps tell us a little bit about your background in terms of, how you've come into being Khalilah Gates, Dr. Gates, Dr. Gates Hill, however you came into that identity. What woke you up to that?
Absolutely. So I think that, first of all, you mentioned identities. And I think that it is very important to recognize that we all have varying identities and who we are really lies in the center of that. And that's our intersectionality and embracing our intersectionality and how all of our identities together impact how we experience the world, impacts how we define various things, including things like wokeness. A little bit about me before I give my very simple definition of wokeness is that I'm a girl born and raised on the west side of Chicago, still live there. I was raised to be the best that I can be. And whatever that was okay as long as it was my best. And I grew up in an environment in which I was middle class, living in a lower socioeconomic neighborhood by choice. My parents made the decision that if you wanted things to be better, you had to be part of that change. And so, though they had the opportunity to and the means to move into different neighborhoods, they intentionally chose to stay in the neighborhood that we grew up in so that we could be part of change. And so, from a very young age, I recognize that you are part of the change that you want to see.
Mhm.
And I practice that today, whether it's in my practice in medicine or whether it is in my role as a medical educator. My North Star is being the change that I want to see.
Mhm.
And part of that change entails this idea of wokeness.
Mhm.
And for me, wokeness means that you are open to the idea of seeing and calling out things that are not right, that can be improved, and you embrace that. Whether it's wokeness from a socioeconomic status, from a race, ethnicity status, from a religion status, it is simply a phenomenon, in my opinion, of allyship in the sense that there are marginalized groups that are disadvantaged. And it is important to recognize the systems and structures that are in place that allow for the persistent marginalization of various groups, and just be willing to own and talk about those and call those structures and policies and procedures out, and also be willing to be a part of the solution.
Mm, mm. That is eloquent and clear and absolutely on the mark. How did you get so wise? I mean, it's not like you're an old lady. You are wise. What is
I
that?
am an old soul. I have been told that I am an old soul.
Huh? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Yes, from the west side, that's the right side. And
Absolutely.
and we know that it's gone through quite I think they call it gentrification, but it's gone through transformation in a lot of different ways. It's not just building up, or refurbishing. It's shifts that happen in mindset, in the way things are done, in location, in terms of what's located in the area. What do you think the Black community in particular contributed to that? I know you stayed to change,
Mhm.
but the community itself, what's been happening in that area?
So I think that whenever you talk about areas of gentrification, and for me, my personal experience is on the west side of Chicago, you have to recognize and be aware of the varying parties. It is the residents and the community that has been there since the beginning, and
Mhm,
it is the what we will call newer comers.
mhm,
And it is important to recognize and embrace the roles of all people involved. And I think when I think about regentrification, I don't necessarily consider regentrification a bad thing. Like most things in life, change is inevitable. And we have to most often embrace change. It is how that change is placed upon people and the tools that you give to people to deal with the change that is important. And so there are many people in the community, particularly the Black community, that made the similar choices to stay and remain in the community that they know. And so now the task as things change is for others in the community. If we're going to really be a community, it means embracing all of that, need to be willing to recognize and put in place things that protect the original community members. And so that could mean anything as far as freezing property tax values so that you don't tax out people who have lived there for generations. It means being friendly neighbors who take time to recognize the neighborhood and the richness of the neighborhood that they have moved into.
mhm,
I'll share one story. On the block that I live now, every Sunday, one of our neighbors would put his speaker in the window
mm,
and would play house music for us. And if it was summer, we would go out, we would be doing our yard work, we would be doing whatever, all kind of bopping to the house music. Last summer, we have a new set of neighbors who came in, and instead of embracing the culture, actually started to call the police for noise pollution. And so when I saw the police one day, I went out, and I might be on film on the police camera, and that's okay. But the sentiment was that that person who has been in the community his entire life is not the problem. And it is the newcomers that need to be willing to spend the time to learn the community and embrace and value all members of the community that is actually most important. And as I'm standing out talking to the police, other neighbors came out as well, to say, hey, like, this is not a him problem. This is a problem for the person who called you, and how can we figure out how to engage them? So, with that said, change requires all parties to have open lines of communication and flexibility. And that's kind of how I see gentrification.
Well, I'm going to just look into my own conceptualizing this because I also wanted to get into this idea of love and war. We're living in a world where those two are quite disjointed. We don't know how to love neighbor. Now, this is love and speak the truth we're talking on here. And so we have to have some spirituality. We have to go deeper. We have to get underneath the words. And so love is a word that we all have different concepts of, and obviously there agape love, romantic love, there are all these different kinds of ways understanding love. I'm thinking of neighbor now, right? I'm thinking of when we first love ourselves and appreciate the gifts that we bring to whatever the relationship is in the community, in the neighborhood. Sometimes that's a very selfish, self-preserving thing, right? And then we have war someplace on the other side. And I don't want to say hate, but the way we act um, when we're sort of against and we don't understand, we don't meet halfway. The guy with the complaint, all he can do was, or she or whomever could say, I don't like this. And it's all about his perspective or her perspective. And the one that's always been there, grounded in whatever he or she wanted to do. So where do you go with that when there's this dichotomy? There's this struggle to be together or not to be together, to get along or not get along. Selfishness and violence. This is all community and it's also personal.
Absolutely. I
Mm.
think that, I am a proud Christian. I was born and raised in the Christian faith. And I think that the principles of that faith, very similar to most, if not all, other faiths, is that you love your neighbor as yourself. And then to understand what that love means, I think you look further. And I am reminded of scripture that says a couple of highlights that love is patient, is kind, love endures. And those are the three things that no matter what type of love it is, whether it's romantic love, whether it's friendship love, those things are at the heart of those feelings. Love is patient in the sense that we are, as humans, are going to have varying ideas. We are going to have conflicts. It's just the nature of being independent thinkers and different people. And we have to, one, embrace that, and two, be patient with ourselves as well as with others so that we can put forth the time to get to understand ourselves, to get to understand others, and then be able to make decisions after that.
Mhm.
Love is kind. We don't always have to agree, but we always need to be kind. We always need to be respectful. We always need to show grace. These are very, to me, fundamental things of living and existing together in community.
And you
And
experience that in the culture? Are you seeing it being lived out in this wokeness that you described?
so I push back a little bit on this concept of wokeness may be creating a different dynamic. I don't think that. I think that if you embrace the concept of love as it has meant to be a fundamental part of humanity, then I think in that comes wokeness. I think we owe it to each other to be woke. And they're not opposing views, in my opinion.
Okay, now.
Uh, I owe it to my LGBTQ family members to be woke about the things that they face, the trials that they face, the fears that they face. I owe it to them, and I embrace that because I love them. And so for me, those two concepts are not in opposition at all. In my thought process, actually feed one another. Because the idea of like wokeness being bad is that because I am aware of who I am and my identities and what comes with that makes who you are and your identities a problem, and that is at the basis of war, right?
Right.
We can't figure out how to coexist in
Right.
who we are.
Mhm.
Yeah, now we're going to have conflict. Now we're going to have war.
Mhm.
And, most wars are based off of some misunderstanding or some desire to have something more,
Mhm.
right, than you have. And that's war on a global scale, that's war on a relationship scale.
Mhm.
And so the concepts are the same. The scale in which we see them is very different.
Right. Yeah. And I think that if we, as neighbors, as friends, as community, and not to make it this pie in the sky thing, as human beings, we somehow drifted away from allowing that love of self and love of neighbor that's somehow entrenched in the way we live our religion out. We define this love in this particular scene, but not across the spectrum. It can't be just, oh, I love my neighbor that goes to the same church or looks the same way or love the same way, you know. And when they step out of that, it's war because I'm afraid you're going to infect me with what you have,
Mhm, mhm,
or I'm going to lose a bit of power because you're taking some of it. You know, that dynamic we want to isolate the reality of what is good for me,
mhm,
and I don't want to see it as possibly that's good for you to have the same rights or the same needs or the same desires,
mhm.
right?
I think the fear of the unknown and the unwillingness to know and learn drives a lot of this.
Unwillingness. Why you that's a great way to put it, because some people just don't want the facts.
Mhm.
Some of us don't want to face what is right here in front of us.
It's easier if I don't have to face it, if I stay and maintain my own beliefs and ideals,
Mhm.
then I somehow am potentially excused from knowing. And it's the safer way, but I would argue that it's the incorrect way to
Mhm.
exist as human beings who feel and think and thrive off of relationships.
I want to jump for a minute to one of the podcasts I listened to that you did with some colleagues, that Get Emergency Care podcast that you did
Mhm.
a year ago or so. One of the episodes I think was about, at least what I noted at the time, was when to go to the emergency room, is what you talked about that day.
Mhm.
And I think in our society and culture right now, post election, a lot of post violence trauma that we have, shootings in school. We just had another one, and we seem to have them every week. I don't know. When you think about it, are we ready as a society to go to the emergency room? Are we having the symptoms necessary to require care?
Absolutely. That it's very interesting that you and only you would make that correlation, but I like it. Imma roll with it because I think it's good. So, I like to think of the emergency room as the last place to go before you have a really horrible outcome,
Mm,
okay? If you don't go to the emergency room in a critical situation, the outcome most likely is death,
mhm,
okay? And I would say that as a society, we need to go to the emergency room. We are in a place and a time in which we are not living up to our own established ideals.
Oh, yeah.
And when we see that there is something wrong to the point that you can't walk down the street without feeling the fear and the despair and the hopelessness, right?
Mhm.
We got to get in the emergency room, or our society as we know it is probably not going to remain the same. But I would argue, and it's what we talked about in the podcast as well, that preventative care is actually what we need to focus on. In medicine, we want to take care of people before they get to the point of needing the emergency room.
Mhm.
right? If you have high blood pressure, we want to see you in the clinic and help you manage your blood pressure and change your diet before your blood pressure gets high enough that you're in the emergency room with a stroke. And so it's a shift in priorities. And so I would contend that as a society, we need to change our shift. Or we need to shift how we think about
Mhm.
our society. We need to start to put in some preventative measures. Violence is not violence because you have a culture that is violent.
Mhm.
Violence is violence because you have a society in which you have people who are consistently for generations living below the poverty line and are hopeless.
Mhm.
And if you give them some hope, then perhaps the violence goes away. You have parts of society that for generations have not felt a purpose.
Mhm.
To live a life with no purpose is questionable at best.
Mhm.
And so, how do we make it so that all of us who desire to live a life with purpose have the opportunity?
Mhm. Mhm.
To do the preventative care, we need to change the way in which we educate people. Why do we not all have the same educational opportunities that are going to lead to advancement? That is then going to lead to changes in potential changes in socioeconomic status. If you leave people in poverty, if you leave people in despair, you're going to get what we have. So we need to step back, in my opinion, and
Mhm.
take a preventative medicine approach.
Mhm.
How can we adjust some of these social factors so that we don't get there? Are we going to be 100% done with violence? No, we're not.
Mhm.
But can we reduce those rates? I truly believe that we can. When we look at these mass shootings, these school shootings, what is driving our children to resort to violence?
Mhm.
Research shows that rates of anxiety and depression in our children, in our youth, are going up,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So the preventative part of that is one, why? We don't have to talk about all the reasons why, but why? And two, are we willing to pour resources into institutions and healthcare system that our youth can get and access the mental health services that they need? Right? These are preventable things if we take the time to put things in place to actually deal with the things that are driving. Is
Yeah.
it simple? No. If it was simple,
Right.
I might be the next president, which I have no desire to be. However, we have to get as a society and into this idea of what are the things that we can do and change that are tangible to actually prevent things and not always be in crisis mode, not always needing to go to the emergency room.
Yeah, I right there I resonate with everything you just said. Unfortunately, maybe I just bring in the other side of it is that I think the driving force right now in our society, and I don't know what the future will bring. It's certainly from my voting standpoint, my political standpoint, it seems a little dire, but I don't need to go there all the way. What I'm seeing evident is a lot of greed and selfishness, a lot of a need for power, and there's a lack of equity, fairness, maybe just fairness in the distribution of even having a voice in our decision making system. I think we have somehow digressed in our human understanding of what makes a healthy society.
I would challenge the idea of digression, and I'm going to challenge it in a way that might seem hopeless, but I don't consider it to be hopeless.
Good.
We are a society that was founded on some not so great principles,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
And it is those principles are at the core of who we are.
Yes.
And so we are living out the principles in which we were founded on. I think if we want true change, we're going to have to change our principles. If you take a society This is a factual information. It is not an opinion that
Mhm.
comes in and completely annihilates a group of people that were here, right? And then you take that same society and you embrace concepts of slavery, concepts of dehumanizing people for economic gain.
Mhm.
That's who we are,
Mhm.
right? We have consistently operated on those principles. And yes, slavery ended, but then we made other laws. We made Jim Crow laws, right? So at the foundation of who we are, we need this hierarchy based
Mhm.
on gender, based on race, based on whatever preference, right? And so we are living out what we are founded on. And if we want something different, which I believe we do, then we have to be willing to talk about it and restructure
Mhm.
our beliefs. And that is the harder part.
Yeah.
When I look at the political climate right now, I truly just see what we always have been politically. And it's not different. It looks different because it's a different time, but it is the same, that there have to be haves and have nots. There have to be hierarchies based on preferences and majorities. That's what we're seeing.
Mhm.
And we haven't been willing to give that up.
You make it a very clear argument and a very clear presentation of how this is history repeating itself because it's been unreconciled somehow.
Absolutely.
And we have not faced the vulnerabilities in our sinfulness as a nation. And so we keep renewing the same story of deficit.
Mhm.
Now, let me just um, make it a little bit more close to home. You are a critical care specialist in
Yes.
the medical field. You are also a mom. You also have a partner, your husband.
Yes.
You also live in the West Side, the Best Side community, which is certainly transitioned through time, but was a pretty tough area to live in. Probably still a lot of shootings there. At the same time, the dwellings and the newcomers have changed the community quite a bit. Personalize for me a minute. Let me just to be curious. If you were to say you want to prepare your own daughter for a life that is confident in who she is and who she's becoming, that is grounded in a community that is full of history, what are the kinds of things you're trying to share with her? She's a beautiful little girl.
Thank you.
So I know you're rubbing off on her in many significant ways, but when we talk to our own about this kind of stuff,
Mhm.
what messages are we giving them?
Absolutely. So I first want to say that this is something that I lose sleep about and worry about on a regular basis. I distinctly remember the year she was born, which was in December of 2019, some events happening. And the next morning I cried because the biggest question that I had was, what type of world am I bringing her into? And I still have that worry because I have a little black girl who is smart and funny and bright and joyful. And I, as her mother, want her to experience nothing but the best.
Mhm.
But also, as her mother, who is also a Black woman in this society, I recognize the challenges that are ahead of her. And so, how do I prepare her for that? I think I go back to my parents, and I think they did pretty good. I think I like to
Mhm.
say, and
I
so,
agree.
and so I don't think I need to change the course. And the course was, one, always have confidence in yourself.
Mhm.
Always know that you are good enough. And that's what I instill in my child. No
Mhm.
matter what anyone else says, you are good enough. You belong in the places that you're in.
Oh, yes.
And that's not your problem if someone else has a problem with that.
Mhm.
I also make sure that she has a sense of history, because I truly believe that understanding history is important to try to prevent us from repeating it, right? I need her to have a sense of pride in who she is as a woman and who she's going to be as a Black woman. I need that to be a pride for her. I need her to have the foundation so that when people try to make that a negative for her, it doesn't impact her. And I intentionally, intentionally want to and continue to teach her the importance of using her voice, being willing to own her feelings and be okay with her feelings, whatever they may be, and be willing to share and process those feelings. I think that the break for me as I think about raising her is that I want her to be that strong Black woman, but that strength is actually going to come for her in owning her feelings, owning her limitations. For so long, that strong Black woman suppressed everything and just kept going despite.
Yeah.
And though I want her to have resilience and perseverance, I also want part of her strength to be able to recognize when she's had enough, when she needs a reset. And
Right.
so those are really the things that I hope to be modeling for her and hope that she has when she becomes a young adult.
Mhm.
So
Mhm. Well, you've always been an inspiration to me, and I tell you, for your daughter to have that kind of ownership of her own person, self-confidence, a sense of where she comes from. Not that she comes from slavery,
yep,
she comes from kings and queens, and she comes from a place of self-determination. All those things that makes it's all in her DNA, and you've somehow made it your purpose to make sure she knows it.
absolutely. But she is a descendant of slaves, and that is okay as well because we slaves built this country. There's no reason for me to not have pride in that. Slaves endured. Slaves have had strength that I don't think many other people have ever experienced. That also is in her DNA. I want her to know that. And I want her to hold on to that strength as well.
Yes, I got to give you an amen there. There's lots to unpack in what you've said. And so I want to just move into one probably last little focus, and that is perhaps you can just give a hint on how that sense of personal awareness and, community awareness and a global awareness comes into play in each other. It's very personal and it's very wide. What's one healing that you think would be helpful for us as a community? I'm taking this mainly from your perspective of the medical, but maybe also as the cultural side, the person who understands the context in a much deeper way than most of us. What's the healing that's necessary for that wide scope of what we need as a community?
Right. And so when I think about that question, I go back to my medical school training. And one of the things that always has resonated with me and is part of the reason why I chose Stritch to go to is that even in taking care of patients, we also treat the human spirit. And for me, it is a reminder, and I literally think about that almost on a daily basis, that illness and sickness, there's science to it. Absolutely. But more importantly, it is the impact that that has on the human spirit.
Mhm.
And if we ignore the humanness, what are we really doing? We're treating a cancer cell or a genetic abnormality, but are we treating the person? And it's really about humanity and personhood for me. And so I think to start to heal, we have to, and it seems very Pollyanna, I get it. but we have to start to treat the human spirit. And the human spirit doesn't change. In my opinion, the human spirit wants to be loved. It wants to feel secure. It wants to have its basic needs met. And if we turn the focus on humanity and the needs of being human, I think everything else figures itself out.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. We got to figure it out. We have to figure it out. Yes. This is beautiful. Would you say that that's your one truth, or do you have some other offering? It sounds completely real, completely true.
I think that my one truth, and it'll come back to kind of what we open with, is
Mhm.
that love endures, and endurance is important because life comes with its ups and downs and twists and turns, and it is how we handle that and what we have in our bag to actually endure. And that endurance comes from faith. That
Mhm.
endurance comes from love. That endurance comes from community.
Mhm.
And so that's my truth, that love endures and endurance is living.
Beautiful. There's an old kind of spiritual, and one line in it that I won't sing into this microphone. It says, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus.
Yes.
And you have been the presence of Jesus for me today. So just want to thank you for being that voice of wisdom. And it really was a great moving experience for me today. So thanks so much, Dr. Gates.
Thank you, Sister Brenda. It was a pleasure.
And now for the wrap up. You have just had a human experience from a spiritual being. We have so much to learn. So go forth to love and speak the truth. Ad majorium Dei Gloria.